So in 2017, going back one previous year, both the U.S. Federal Trade Commission and Apple sue Qualcomm for basically the same thing, saying that Qualcomm was using its market position as the dominant smartphone modem supplier to force manufacturers into paying excessive fees. And this is one that I want to sort of dive in on. We spent a bunch of time advancing through the timeline to really get to this particular point, which I think is a great place to zoom in on Qualcomm's strategic position today, is this Apple lawsuit. So some background. Apple has always used either Samsung processors in the first iPhones until they switched to their own. But they still had to pay Qualcomm patent royalties for whatever RF stuff they were using. So whether, let's treat the CPU as its completely own world, transitioning from Samsung to the A-series processors. Apple probably has to buy stuff from Qualcomm. Maybe they could look somewhere else, but either way, they're paying Qualcomm the licensing for it. Today, Apple does use Qualcomm cellular modems, which started in 2011, and there was just 1 year where they used Intel where they did not use Qualcomm. We're going to talk about that. So the way that I essentially perceive this and why Apple eventually initiated the lawsuit is Qualcomm got greedy. They had patents on technologies that were part of standards that were set by industry consortiums all over the world, and they leveraged those patents in basically every way possible. And here's the economics as far as I could sort of suss it out. So they asked Apple for $7.50 per phone sold, which comes to about $2 billion a year, plus an additional 8 to 10 when they were going to raise prices later. And so you quickly get to a situation where that Qualcomm was sort of expecting Apple to pay $17 just to license patents, right? Which is
no chips
on top of the price that they were paying for those baseband chips. So rack rate for a baseband chip, and baseband chips are the same thing as sort of cellular modems, is $30 a chip. And it's not actually $30. It's more like 5% of whatever the average selling phone price is.
Guess what phones have a really high average selling price?
iPhones. And so if you think about 250 million phones a year, that is $7.5 billion a year that Apple would be paying Qualcomm. That would be 20% of the QCT revenue, 20% of all of the chip revenue that Qualcomm makes. And further, if you back out the 14 million a year from QCT, their chip segment, that doesn't come from the chips for handsets specifically, but rather there's some other stuff they're working on, automotive, IoT, and this new thing that they're calling the RF front-end radios product line, which we'll also talk about.
This is cool.
Apple could make up to 1/3 of Qualcomm's handset chip revenue. Now, analysts have estimated that Apple negotiated down from $30 to $10. Apple's general counsel during the lawsuit let the number $18 slip. So whether it's 10, 18, or $30 a pop, that is an enormous amount of revenue that Apple pays Qualcomm. Again, not for a Snapdragon, not for the CPU, not for the system on a chip, just for the RF cellular modem.
Wild.
So there's some other interesting things that came out in this lawsuit. Qualcomm asked Apple to speak out against WiMAX, which is a competing technology. And they were like, we need you to vocally speak out that our competitor is a bad piece of technology. They also stipulated that if Apple ever used a competing supplier, and keep in mind this deal is signed in the early days of the iPhone, if they ever used a competing supplier to Qualcomm, they would owe Qualcomm $1 billion. Wow. So what Apple is basically doing is biding their time for there to be an actual credible competitor. And they had to wait all the way up until the 4G days, until they're like looking at Intel and they're like, especially if we work with you and we work closely with you, we think you can be a credible competitor to Qualcomm right now. We think your cellular modems business is like close enough where our customers won't notice the difference, and we can tell Qualcomm that we're going to use you and try to get a little bit of
enough leverage there.
Yep. What Qualcomm interpret that as is, well, now you owe us $1 billion because look at our original deal we did. what this basically comes down to from a legal perspective is because Qualcomm owns patents that are a part of an industry standard, they have to charge a price that is fair, reasonable, and non-discriminatory, or FRAND is the industry terminology. And Apple's basically alleging, look, you're abusing the market because it's not fair, reasonable, and you're highly, highly unreasonable in the way that you're charging us this. So around the time of the iPhone XS and XR, those phones actually did use Intel modems. But what was basically happening is the Intel modems were falling further and further behind Qualcomm. Apple was realizing, oh crap, we're going to miss 5G because there's no chance that Intel catches up and can actually develop a credible 5G chip. And so they end up settling and sort of backing off their big lawsuit with Qualcomm.